and a very warm welcome to the Flourishing Together podcast, where we explore questions of hope and stewardship in education. My name is Ryan Parker, the RE and Christian Ethos Advisor for the Diocese of St Albans, and it's an absolute joy to make available this first episode of this new podcast series. For this first episode, we thought we'd love to set a little bit of background and context for this podcast. So over the pandemic, myself and colleague Hannah in the schools team put together and recorded some In Conversation With videos, which we put on the Diocese of St Albans website. For each of these, I was joined by an expert practitioner in the world of collective worship, and we discussed various aspects of worship, such as pupil-led worship, variety in worship, class-based worship as well. And we were really pleased with the feedback and thought, well, what if we took this model and we applied it to a podcast series? At first, that question was pretty much offered in jest, but I'm really delighted that actually that's taken some legs, and we're able to offer these podcasts widely. So we started by exploring lots of different ideas and titles for the podcast series to begin with. We wanted something that was sufficiently broad and sufficiently narrow enough so that we could explore a range of aspects within education, but through a particular lens with a particular focus. And we pondered a few biblical texts and narratives because we felt it really important to kind of underpin all of the aspects that we're talking about within a biblical theme. We thought that would give it a real richness. And we pondered a few, and one that really stood out to us was the road to Emmaus, a text found in Luke's Gospel in the New Testament. It was such a rich text where so many themes constellate around. And I'm really delighted that we're joined by Simon today. Simon, hello and welcome.
Hi Ryan, it's great to be here.
I'm so pleased you can join us, Simon. Would you like to just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm currently serving as parish priest in the parish of Mill End and Heronsgate with West Hyde, which is the final kind of finger of St Albans Diocese on the southeastern side. 10 minutes in the car one way, you're into London Diocese, 10 minutes one way, you're into Oxford Diocese. And I've served here as parish priest for 11 years. Prior to here, I was in Hemel Hempstead for 7.5 years, and prior to that, I was in Biggleswade for 4.5, serving my curacy. And one of the things that I've been passionate about since day one as a deacon serving the church has been ministry in schools. Whether that's been collective worship, serving as a governor, providing input in lessons, and so on and so on and so on. So that's kind of cut me in half like a stick of rock. Work with schools runs in my core. The other thing just to flag up also is I serve on the Diocese Board of Education and have done off and on over the 23 years, good grief, I've served in St Albans Diocese. So there you are, a little bit about me.
Thank you so much, Simon. We're really pleased that you're able to join us to reflect on this text with us. So I mentioned that this podcast series is very much rooted in the road to Emmaus narrative. And the podcast title that we've arrived at is this: Flourishing Together, Journeys of Hope and Stewardship in Education. And as I mentioned, there are just so many themes from this New Testament narrative that we can ponder and link to this title. And I know for me personally, in the last few years, each time I've gone back to read and reflect on this text, I've got something different. Maybe that's because of something that I've been thinking about, or something that's happened that day that just sparked off different thoughts, or something that's particularly pertinent to the educational landscape and journey that we've experienced and recognised has changed in the last, say, 48 months. So we felt it'd be really nice to frame this podcast series that we're about to embark upon within this text. So I wonder, Simon, from your point of view, would you be able to share some reflections on how this road to Emmaus narrative might link to this podcast series of Flourishing Together, Journeys of Hope and Stewardship in Education?
Sure. I mean, it seems to me that it's a really appropriate text for us to be dwelling on as we edge out of the worst of the impact of the pandemic, particularly because the story is focused on newness and a changing landscape. You've got women previously arriving at an empty tomb. There's a missing body. There's news of someone risen from the dead. And then there are these two people walking on a road to the village of Emmaus, and they have no real clue what they are thinking, what they are feeling. They are just stunned as the whole landscape that they thought they understood with Jesus' teaching ministry and so on has just been radically changed. And I guess my experience, Ryan, is that as we walk with friends and colleagues, going for a walk on a Saturday or a Sunday, we have to do a fair bit of talking, catch up with folk and so on. And it's the same with this story too. This 14-mile round trip tells us of a kind of inner emotional and spiritual journey that Cleopas and the other unnamed disciple go on. It's really interesting, I think, when we go for a walk in the countryside, maybe, we do like talking with the people we go with. If you spend any time, perhaps, having a facilitated conversation with a coach, they will also often, if you're stuck on an idea, encourage you to go for a walk. Walking really does open us up physically and spiritually as we begin to dwell on new things. And they can lead us to deep conversations. And on that journey, those two disciples, Cleopas and the other unnamed disciple, they're joined by a stranger. What are you talking about? The stranger asks them. Now, you and I know that stranger is Jesus, but they don't at this point. But it's clear when we listen to the story that the walk that they've been on has done its work. The disciples are ready to talk with this unnamed stranger. And in response to Jesus, as we know him's question, Cleopas then goes on to talk about the story of the life, death and resurrection of Jesus. And it's really clear how there is surprise in their response and a rawness in their emotions. They're still struggling with disbelief and the change in the landscape that they find themselves in. They're aware of the facts, but there's kind of an unknownness, if that's a word, it is now. And as you look at the story, Jesus asks those two, Cleopas and the other disciple, to do something vital. He invites them to listen. And I guess that's one of the most important things that we can do as individual Christians, as church communities, as school communities, is listen attentively to our staff teams, to our fellow governors, to our support staff, to obviously our pupils, because there's going to be a range of emotional responses. People's physical health hopefully is good, but their emotional health over the last 2.5 years has been really challenged. We could do really well to listen deeply to one another. I guess the other thing that we could do well is as we listen, as Jesus invites us to, is listen carefully to our school community. Where are we now? Jesus walks with these disciples, that 7-mile journey to Emmaus. There's conversation, there's listening. We've journeyed a difficult and strange road during this pandemic. And actually, where we are now is hugely different to where we were 2.5 years ago. So doing some listening to our context, I think, is also going to be really, really vital. We can discover a source of blessing, I guess, as Cleopas and the other disciple did too, on that way. The scripture that we hear that story of the road to Emmaus in there, Ryan, the word that's used to describe the sort of listening that Jesus invites Cleopas and the other disciple to is actually the word inclining. It's an intimate kind of a word, a kind of moving closer to. There's a physicality, an invitation into a deep relationship of love and trust, a kind of heart to heart, if you like. And Jesus calls Cleopas and the other disciple into doing just that. into a really deep listening, not just to the story, not just to each other in our school context, not just to maybe those whom we teach and learn with, those whom we work alongside, and so on, but actually as church schools to the source of all of our wisdom, and that's to Jesus. And there's something quite powerful about that intimate, that moving closer to, that heart to heart that we're being invited to as we enter this new landscape, dare I say, post-pandemic. The other thing about that deep listening that Jesus invites Cleopas and the other disciple into is it reminds me of one of the rich resources of the church. The father of Western monasticism, St. Benedict, who is one of my touchstones, he uses that word, listen, again and again and again in the rule that he wrote for his followers to live out. And that invitation to listen, I think, comes to us again at the start of this new school year, at the start of this new term, as our children move into new classes, as new teachers perhaps are part of our school communities, as we begin new work as governors, as parish priests, and as church communities, we support our church schools and the wider school communities. We're invited to that shared deep listening. And the impact of that story of Jesus' encounter with Cleopas and the other unnamed disciple is that they discover in that walking and that talking, that listening, that sharing of the story, that Jesus has been present with them all the way, whether they realised it or not. And suddenly in the breaking of the bread, in the act of worship, if you like, in the Eucharist, Jesus is revealed, and the disciples then peg it back to the city of Jerusalem and burst in and tell their friends what they have encountered. I guess the deep reflecting points for me as a governor, as a parish priest who is passionate about church schools and about work with schools generally, as we start this new term, is I think we're called to walk still very close alongside our schools. There's much that God calls us to do together. There's still that call to share that story. Cleopas opens up with Jesus about what they've known and seen and experienced. Let's tell the story of what it is we've experienced. Continue to reflect on the impact of the pandemic, but also continue to tell the story of Jesus Christ in that context. But Jesus invites Cleopas and the other disciple into deep listening. And maybe we actually should be listening very attentively to our pupils, to our staff, our support staff, our governors, our wider community, as to how we can best go deeply together and in this season as we move out, please God, of the worst of the pandemic.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much, Simon, for providing your reflections on this text. And there's just so much that we could drill into here, and I made lots of notes as you were talking there. And I wonder, for those listening, whether you're a school leader, a governor, a teacher, or maybe you wear another hat in walking alongside or within schools, I wonder what you might take from this narrative and the reflections that Simon's just offered. What really resonated with me is this sense of dialogue, this sense of walking together as a community. And it's been such a challenging time in the last few years in education. And I'm constantly inspired just how school communities have each listened to the needs of their own unique context and responded in such an amazing way, in the ways in which they've navigated the last few years in such a hopeful manner. And you also mentioned this time of newness, and at this start of this new academic year, I think it gives a real great chance just to look back at the journey that perhaps us individually, but also as a school community, have been on, to recognise where we are at this point, and then to look forward, hopefully, to think, how do we want to travel? Where do we want to travel? What's on our to-do list, but also what's on our to be list in so many ways, which resonates with those experiences of those disciples as they were walking along that Emmaus road. And I really do hope that this podcast opens up an opportunity where we can all journey together. We can listen, we can reflect, we can ponder how we and the communities that we're a part of, the communities that we serve, can move forward with hope, with the flourishing of all at that centre. So I really do thank you, Simon, for taking the time to share those thoughts with us. And so I'm really delighted for this podcast series. It is coming to fruition. And for each episode of the podcast series, I'll be joined by colleagues in the world of education to discuss a particular area. In this first series, we're going to take a particular focus on spirituality and the really fascinating area of spiritual development. And I really do hope that you can journey alongside us and you can journey with us. So thank you so much again, Simon, and I look forward to seeing you next time.